For centuries, Britain was ruled not by the many, but by the very few. Rotten boroughs, controlled by aristocratic patrons, returned members of parliament even when barely anyone lived there. Industrial cities, bursting with thousands of people, meanwhile, had no representation at all. This is the making of Britain, the story of how land, law, and power shaped an island. In each episode, we trace a turning point that changed what Britain was and what it would become, the Britain that we know today. When I think of early 19th century Britain, I picture a society in transition. The Industrial Revolution was booming. Mills in Manchester, ironworks in Birmingham, dockyards in Liverpool. But in Parliament, the representation of the people remained rooted in the Middle Ages. Some towns that had been important centuries before still sent MPs to Westminster despite having almost no residents. These were the infamous rotten boroughs. Old Sarum in Wiltshire was perhaps the most notorious. An empty hilltop with barely a handful of voters, yet it still elected 2 MPs. Meanwhile, Manchester and Birmingham, modern powerhouses with tens of thousands of workers, had no MPs at all. Elections were rarely democratic. Voting rights were restricted to property-owning men, often just a few dozen in a borough. Bribery and coercion were common. It wasn't a parliament of the people, it was a parliament of the landowners. And yet, pressure for change was building. The French Revolution and Napoleonic Wars had frightened the British elite, who feared that any concessions could unleash chaos. But by the 1820s, the sheer mismatch between industrial Britain and medieval representation could not be ignored. So when King George IV died in 1830 and his brother William IV took the throne, the stage was set for one of the most bitter political battles of the century. But what kind of law could change the balance without tipping Britain into revolution? The campaign for reform was long and bitter. The Whig government, led by Prime Minister Earl Grey, introduced a reform bill in 1831. Its aim? To abolish many rotten boroughs, redistribute seats to growing towns and counties, and broaden the franchise, though only modestly, extending the vote to middle-class men who owned or rented property worth £10 a year. This sounded tame enough today, but in the politics of 1831, it was incendiary. Tories denounced it as an attack on the Constitution. The House of Lords rejected the bill outright. That rejection lit a fire across Britain. Crowds gathered in towns and cities demanding reform. The days of May in 1832 saw near insurrection in places like Bristol and Nottingham, with riots, fires and attacks on symbols of aristocratic power. Petitions poured into Parliament with hundreds of thousands of signatures. Reform had been not just a political question, but a national crisis. Faced with unrest, Earl Grey took a gamble. He persuaded William IV to threaten the creation of enough new Whig peers to swamp the House of Lords if they blocked reform again. Reluctantly, the Lords gave way. The Reform Act of 1832 passed into law. But did this movement truly make Britain democratic? Or was it a carefully managed revolution from above? The Reform Act's changes were both sweeping and cautious. The abolition of rotten boroughs. 56 boroughs with tiny electorates lost their MPs, 30 more had their representation cut in half. The redistribution of seats. Growing industrial towns like Manchester, Birmingham, Leeds and Sheffield gained representation for the first time. An extension of the franchise. The vote was given to men who owned or rented property worth £10 a year in boroughs and to larger groups of leaseholders and tenants in counties. This roughly doubled the electorate from around 435,000 to 813,000 men. But in a population of 14 million, this was still a small minority. Working class men, women of all classes, and the poor remained excluded. So the Act was less about democracy and more about rebalancing the power. It shifted political influence from rural landowners to urban middle-class men, the industrialists, merchants and professionals who now demanded their say. It was, in other words, a law designed to preserve the system by reforming it just enough to avoid revolution. But the legacy of the Reform Act wasn't just in who could vote, it was in the principle that the system could change at all. After 1832, politics could never again be entirely closed. New political parties, including the modern liberal and conservative identities, began to form around the altered electorate. Campaigning became more organised. Newspapers reported on debates with fresh intensity. But disappointment was also profound. The working classes had fought for reform too, yet they found themselves still voiceless. Out of this exclusion grew the Chartist movement of the 1830s and 40s, demanding universal male suffrage, secret ballots, and annual parliaments. They did not succeed immediately, but they kept alive the idea that democracy had to go further. The Reform Act was therefore a beginning, not an end. It cracked open the door to representation, but only just. Later reforms in 1867 and 1884 and into the 20th century would widen the franchise to most men and eventually to women. But the first step, the precedent, was 1832. And that step came not from generosity, but from fear. Fear of unrest, fear of collapse, fear of the people themselves. When I look back at the Reform Act of 1832, I see a law of paradoxes. It was radical in destroying rotten boroughs, yet cautious in limiting the franchise. It was driven by mass protest, yet crafted by elites to protect their own interests. It was a safety valve, but also a spark. It did not create democracy, but it made democracy thinkable. It showed that laws could evolve with society, even if only under immense pressure. And once that door had opened, it could never again be fully shut. Thank you for walking a little further down the road that made Britain with me. The story winds on. Try this one. I think you'll like it. Until then, thanks so much for watching. Take care, and I'll see you very soon.